Good morning, everyone. Come on in. We want to get started this morning. I've been looking forward to today for a while now because I want as many people of our church to hear the story of the mission work in Africa that's been going on for over 50 years, that was initiated, as it says there, in 1977 through Ken and Ann Bolden, who were sponsored by the Hermitage Road Church in those days, now known as the Three Chop Church. So I don't want to take up too much of Ken's time. He's a dear friend, devoted Christ follower, missionary to peoples of all nations across the world. He loves the Lord, and I'm going to let Ken take it from here. Ken?
There we go. Oh, yeah, yeah. Good morning, Vietnam. How's everybody doing this morning? Yeah. Habariako. Oyaware Oru. What? I'm not communicating. I don't know what's going on. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ken Bolden. Hey, buddy. Come here and give me a hug. When I was talking with Ben about coming up here, he said if you could sort of incorporate a little bit of your history with both the Hermitage Road Church and with Three Chopped. Just out of curiosity, how many in here know me? Let me try this. How many do not know me? All right, it's about 50-50. I want to tell you a story. I came back here. I went to Kenya in April of 1978. And I came back here and I asked the elders at Hermitage Road if they would let me go to Tanzania to take Kenyans with me. And they said, only if you'll come spend a year in Richmond. And I said, why do I want to spend a year in Richmond? They said, because half the church does not know who you are. Yeah, I got that same problem again. I began communicating with a lady back in March of last year. And she said, who are you? And I said, I am the most famous missionary you have never heard of. Because I've spent nearly 35 years of my life living on the continent. And I've lived in 3 African nations. And we're going to talk about that this morning. But we also want to incorporate this church and its history. Now, Ben mentioned 1977 to 2075. That's been my association. But before me was a man named Lawrence Barr. How many of you knew Lawrence Barr? Okay. Lawrence is like me, and he's old and decrepit. He's 5 years older than me. And they live down in Corinth, Mississippi. And his wife has Parkinson's, and so he's not traveling. But he was your introduction to world missions. We're going to talk about that a little bit this morning. All right. When we came in 1978, that's what we looked like. I have not changed that much. I still have a mustache. And that's my daughter Amanda and Abby in my arms. We didn't know, But when we got to Kenya, we found out that Ann was pregnant with our third one. This picture on the right is a picture of my girls and Ann in March of last year. I'm sorry, March of 22. She passed away Thanksgiving Day last year. I'm sorry, no, of 22. So I've been a widow for 2 years now. But she's a very important part of this work. We're going to talk a little bit about through the years. There we are standing on the equator, and there's the typical little missionary couple out in Africa, you know, as we're working. We spent our first 5 years out in Western Kenya working with the Luo people. And just through the years, we would come in, Shirley Herod and Sue Bourne. The Bournes took care of us for the first, I think, 5 or 8 years. Yeah, and then we got kidnapped by Shirley and Norman. If you go to their house and look at their stairs going upstairs, you'll see scars going up those stairs. Those are our suitcases with that bunch as we were in and out. But our target was Kenya. For those of you, here we have the nation of Kenya, East Africa on the equator, and a country about the size of Texas. And this was the original Kisii team. To your far right, you can barely see him, but that tall, lanky guy is Lawrence Barr. The church here, he was your first missionary in your history. I'm talking about HR, Hermitage Road, and Three Chopped. In 1972, he and Faye went into Uganda. They'd been there about 3 months when Idi Amin declared the church to be illegal, and they escaped with 3 other families by the skin of their teeth and got to Kenya. He worked with a man named James Moore, and who was also on the Uganda team. They came into Kenya. They surveyed for a year, and they decided to work with Luo people out on Lake Victoria. James contacted hepatitis, ruined his liver, came back to the States, was recruiting, and recruited me. I came here in June of 1977 and met with the elders, met with the deacons, and in April of 1978, we and the Bars arrived together in Kenya. On the other side are David and Betty Kinnemer. They were retired school teachers. We thought he was old. He was 62. I'm 73. But he was the old man. I did both of their funerals. At retirement age, they went at age 62 and spent 6 years living in East Africa. And when I did his funeral, they asked me what he left in his will for me to do was tell funny Africa stories. That was the highlight of his life. We worked with the Luo people. This is a picture of the Luo as they would have looked in 1902. They're a Nilotic tribe migrated out of the Sudan down the Nile River. Many of you never heard of Luo, but one of our former presidents by the name of Barack Hussein Obama, his father was a Luo. So I'm one of 10 guys in the United States that can speak President Obama's father's language. But anyhow, that and $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks. But this is the Luo. Essentially what we do, or what we did, is we were the Jetsons, and they were the Flintstones. And we got there in that age when as they were coming into modernity. And we had a ball. They did not look like that. This is what they looked like in the early 70s. A lot of the people had these tin houses with tin roofs. A lot of them were still in grass roofs. But we were out working with, I always worked with at least 25 churches, small groups. We were always either church planning, evangelism, church planning, church development, and working with church leaders. Now in November 1978, there are 2 people I want you to look at, and one is up on the top right. There's an older woman with white hair, and she's got a purse on her hip. And her name is Mary Ruth Jenkins. And down on the bottom left, that's me in the little blue jumpsuit, and next to me, is Bill Jenkins, and we're standing at the border of Kenya and Tanzania and shaking hands across the border. But Bill Jenkins and Ken Huff were the elders here when I came, and you had a preacher here named Charles Clodfelter who planted the vision of this church having its own live missionaries somewhere in the world, going where Christ had not gone, planting churches. That is a part of your history. It needs to be a part of your DNA, because that's the reason that Christ created his church. And what a ball we had. Teaching, preaching, planting churches, training leaders. In 1983, I came in one day and my wife said, you need to make you got two choices. She said, you can find a new wife or a new school teacher. She said, I'm done with homeschooling. And so I scrambled, and they invited us to come into Nairobi, Kenya, the capital city. At that time, a town of about 1 million people. Today, it's 4.5 million. And we spent 15 years in Nairobi. And so essentially, when we look at my work in Nairobi, it was 5 years working in the slums with the very poor, with Luos in Luo language. I planted 5 Luo churches. I was the only white guy in town that spoke Luo. I had a ball. It's like picking peaches. And I did more than that, but that was my prayer. And then in 1987, African church leaders came and said, you're embarrassing us. You need to get out of the slums. We want you into working class. And so we helped to plant the Dandora Church of Christ. That was in Swahili. 5 years in Luo, 5 years in Swahili. So kila siku nilianza nikufundisha watu kwa Kiswahili. So I just began to preach and teach in Swahili. And then my last years, it was in English. If you're going to Kenya today, you get by in English, but not 48 years ago. So this is the city of Nairobi. It was a great place to live, raise kids. And here I am with my little Suzuki Jeep overlooking Mathare Valley slum. And I did slum work at night. I went down into these slums. I went into Mathare Valley. It had 200,000 people living in cardboard shacks. I went to Kibera. I went into Kariobangi. I went into Omo. I went into these slums at night because that's when working guys were at home. And I'd teach till 11 o'clock at night and drive out of there and drive home. I would not do that today for love or money. But in that day, it was safe. And it was great. 1987, my parents came over, and I had the privilege of translating for my dad. We went out to Western Kenya. My dad would preach, and I would translate into Luo, and we'd be in Nairobi. I'd translate Swahili. That's my mom. They made him an honorary elder, and that was a Dandora church. I went over there last year, and Dandora's still there. There's that Dandora church, and now, here's what I run into, is people come up and say, are you Bolden? I said, yeah. I said, oh, my dad loved you. Or I was out in Western Kenya, out at Sotik, Kenya, in a Kalenjin, Kipsigi's audience. And I said, I wish there were some Luos here, but we're far away from Luo. And back in the corner, I heard, and I thought, you're Luos? What are you doing up here? These guys were dressed in suits. I mean, this is not barefoot and straw hats. And after church, he comes up to me holding a kid. I said, what part of Luo land are you from? He said, do you know Mariwa? I said, yeah, in 1979, I baptized Eliezer Ocheng, and I worked with that church and developed the church. I think he passed away a couple of years ago. He said, that's my grandfather. In my arms is his great-grandson, and we are raising him in the Lord. That's what you get to do when you stay long enough. but it's a ball. We also opened up our Bible college. Lord willing, in March, I'll be teaching at Nairobi Great Commission School. This was the beginnings. That's me, Dad, on the right with our first graduation class. But we now have a full-fledged, accredited 2-year Bible college in Nairobi called Nairobi Great Commission School, where I taught and where I served as registrar for several years. Things I did in Nairobi, and I didn't bring my glasses. I can't even read my own writing. But I planted 5 churches in the slums. 1987, we did Dandora. 1994, we did a middle-class church called Dunhome. 1989, I came back to the States. I taught at Whites Ferry Road School of Preaching for a year. Put my kids in American school. I taught 7 years at Great Commission School. I taught the first computer course. I taught myself computer and taught the first computer course and had it approved by the Ministry of Education in Nairobi. Between 1983 and 1997, I taught 120 one-week-long seminars somewhere out in the bush. In 15 years, 2 of those years, I was away from home somewhere out in different areas around the country teaching seminars. Extension education was my thing. In 1994, we established the Nairobi Great Commission School Extension School. We have 9 branches of that. So during the year, every month, I would be out at one of those extensions, and I did the miraculous. I managed to get Church of Christ missionaries to cooperate with other Church of Christ missionaries to take turns teaching in those things, and it helped create a united church. It was a ball. 1992, we did the first ever Pan-American, Pan-African and Africans Claiming Africa conference. We had African church leaders from 22 nations that we got together. This had never happened before, to create an organization called ACA, Africans Claiming Africa. And it meets every 2 years somewhere on the continent of Africa. And we now have 35 African nations participating in that thing. And during all that time, I also did 2 MAs. I did an MA through Wheaton in Chicago. I did it there in Nairobi. And then I did an MA in communications at Daystar University. So I came back here in 1997 and asked the elders to send me to Tanzania. And we formed a team. And I mentioned earlier, this was the first zebra team. Can you guess why we called it a zebra team? Black, white, black, white. We have 3 African families and 2 American families. Ryan and Linda Hammett joined us. He had been a teenager in a church I preached in Illinois back in 1975 and 77. And now in his 40s with 4 kids, he was ready to come to Africa. And we had 3 African families, the Ngojes, the Sures, and the Omolos. And we went there and planted a church. Now, Tanzania was our choice. It was because it was the next country down. We were not that far from Kenya, but we wanted the Kenyans to become cross-culture missionaries. So they thought, well, we speak Swahili. They got to Tanzania, they didn't speak Swahili. First sermon, they were up preaching, and one of the church leaders says, "You're speaking like a baby. This is Tanzania. Say this 3 times." We just laughed. That's the way they did us when I was learning to speak Luo. We said, yes, these guys are going to become real missionaries now. They stayed down there 10 years. There are not many Church of Christ missionaries that stay in a place for 10 years. But these guys did good work. We were right at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro. That's Moshi, Tanzania. Moshi stands for smoke. I lived right at my house was just over on the other side of those buildings. So most mornings I suffered. I would get up and go out on my portico, and Felix, my cook, would bring me my coffee, and I would sit there and watch the snow in Kilimanjaro and see if I could see anybody up there climbing. Somebody had to do it. But while we were there, we were the first zebra team from Kenya to move to another country. We knew from the ACA conference back in 1992 That's what missionaries were going to have to do. We had 142 missionaries through the years. But usually when they finished, they were ready to go home. And I came home and my parents pitched a fit and I went anyway. So we planted a church in the city. I adjuncted at Lipscomb University. I taught the spring semester for 3 years at Lipscomb and taught missions courses and taught undergraduate students and recruited. We had 40 students yearly that came over for 10 weeks as we taught English as a second language in the Tanzanian schools. We taught 1,600 children a day how to speak English, as Tanzania had passed a law that all high school had to be done in English, but they were still doing Swahili in elementary school. And it was a disaster course. And I worked with Ministry of Education, and they let us bring kids in. And after 2 summers of that, those Tanzanian kids were speaking English. It was amazing. By the way, Mary Ruth East, who was born here and raised here, I was just with her dad down in, she's a pediatrician now at Vanderbilt, but her dad was my missions coordinator. He was a deacon here. And Mary Ruth was a student at Lipscomb, and she came and helped us build the program. I'm going to show you a picture here. Back there on the back right, rubbing her glasses, is a lady that we knew as Amy Brown. How many of you remember Eldon and Beth? I was only there in Tanzania 5 summers. She went 7. She was out at Lubbock, and she kept that program running. Next to her is Shane Huff. Shane was from the Whites Ferry Road Church. He worked with Peace Corps for 3 years. He came over and worked with us for 3 years. I just saw his son the other day. He's got a son now that's about 6'3" and looks just like him. But he did 25 years with the State Department in Ecuador. Down to the right, this blonde girl, her name is Emily Miller. She was a sophomore at Lipscomb. She married a guy that was a fine arts major at Lipscomb. Because of their summer in Tanzania, they came back and decided to be missionaries. They went to Kansas State, did degrees in English as second language. They've just finished their 22nd year in Tanzania. I bet you know Jason and Emily. Yeah. And the church is still there. And went by and visited with it when I was there last year. 2003, I came back to the States to take care of parents. And Hermitage Road said, go find a job. So I went down to Whites Ferry Road and was director of World Radio. And I did that for 6 years and traveled around. And I was telling Shirley yesterday, what do you do when you're director of a thing like World Radio? You're in 50 churches a year. What do you think about that? So anyway, in 2015, we were contacted, and in West Africa is a little country called Liberia, and they wanted me to come and use my academic credentials to help them get accreditation. So we moved to Liberia, West Africa. We were at Monrovia. You see the little circle there, and that's and I want to encourage any of you that are walking the line, and your relationship with Jesus is not what it ought to be. Correct it, because if you don't shape up when you die, you will go to Liberia. 82 degrees in the morning and 82% humidity. It'd get up to 102, 103. We had people stealing our electricity, and I did a lot of sweating. But when we left, this is what our little college looks like. I worked with the Ministry of Education. I rebuilt the place. We built a greenhouse. We rebuilt the kitchen. We rebuilt the dorms. We built a library. And we had everything lined up for their accreditation. This is a faculty meeting. This is in my living room. I had 9 teachers. All of them had bachelor's degrees. And we worked together in course development, teaching methodologies, and discipling these students while we had them. But also as director, I was expected to get out and represent the school. We had about 120 churches in the country. Now you can see, I dress like these guys. That's me with a white beard in the middle on the left. But this is the way I look most of the time. Do you see that blue shirt? Can you see how sweaty that is? I'll tell you what, that place, it was hot. But I did seminars every week. Every week I'd go out to some church and just trying to, they'd not had an American missionary in 30 years. And so they tried to kill me. And there's Miss Ann. Some of you, any of you, do you remember Ann, my wife? She passed away Thanksgiving Day 2 years ago. But you need to know she was on the scene. We were building a greenhouse, and those poor guys, they didn't know anything about construction, and so we did all the pole setting. It was time for them to put up screen, and she just in a huff went down there and said, "I'm going to show you how to do this one time, and you guys learn how to do this, you know." But she was such a big part of that. Here I am decked out in my academic garb as we have our graduating class. This guy with his little gold thing, he was our valedictorian. But these guys were finishing an Associate of Arts degree from Liberia Bible College. We were on conditional accreditation. They could walk across town, go to the University of Liberia and enroll. And for that, I enjoyed, I'm thankful. And this is one of the last really good pictures of Ann and I, is decked out in our Liberian stuff. And we had a ball. Now, I go back, many of you know our story that we got back in 2019, found out that Ann had stage 3 colon cancer. She never would do a colonoscopy. If you hadn't had yours, turn or burn, repent. Because she said, "I've never been sick, I don't need one." When they found it, it was stage 3, and it was the size of a softball. So that clipped my wings. What we did then for the next 4 years was try to save her life. And so I was sitting around my house not knowing what to do, I guess in grief, in early 2023. And One Kingdom, what used to be World Radio, came up to me and said, "Hey, you want to go to Africa?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay, we're going." So we flew over. They were there 3 days and they left me. So I stayed for 12 weeks and had a ball. Went and saw old friends, visited. And so in 23, one of my best friends, he's a medical doctor, Jim Wilson, retired from medicine and got coerced into taking over a new Bible college in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Addis Ababa Bible College. And so he called and said, "I need you." So beginning in 23, I went over and taught 2 courses at academic level, BA level. And then this year, I flew over and taught 2 courses. Got back in June, worn out. He called and said, "I need you to come back." So I went back in July and taught 2 more courses. So I'm spending an average of 4 months a year in Africa, in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is very influenced by the Coptic church. You can do some research on Coptic. Here I am. The students on the right, they all have bachelor's degrees. They're graduates. They can write tests, they can answer questions, they can do all that in English. They cannot speak a word. And you talk about frustrating. Number one, I don't like to use translators. And number 2, to have to use a translator to converse, to find out if they're learning. So it's the hardest education I've ever done. But this is Mogus on my right, and Mogus has worked with Americans for his whole life, and he's a good translator, and the students are doing well. That's where I got this fancy garb. Now, some of you want to know about this thing. You guys don't know this. This is a tuxedo. I didn't know. But After I taught my first year, they put on a banquet. They had a lady come in and make traditional Ethiopian food, and they presented me these two gifts. And one of these is this, it's kind of like homespun, but it's decorated with the embroidery. And this is what you would wear if your child was graduating from high school or you were invited to go to a political meeting. This is dress up. And then the piece that goes over it shows that you're recognized as an elder. So I thought that would be fun today, and you may not remember me or remember my name, but you'll remember the fancy get-up. So while I was there this year, here were these two elderly men. On the left, over on this side, is Hobtu. He lives in Washington, D.C., works for the patent people in the U.S. government, but he works off of a computer, has 130 employees, and flies every other month to Addis, and is overseeing all the construction. He was my student at Nairobi Great Commission School. On the right is Alamahu. He oversees the deaf school and the Bible college. He was my student at Nairobi Great Commission School. And so this year I flew down to Uganda, Whites Ferry Road. One Kingdom asked me to go to Uganda and take a look at some work there they'd been asked to get involved in. And so here I am with Charles Chariot. Charles was in my class, my first class, 1990, at Nairobi Great Commission School. And then he married a little girl that I was teaching in the computer class. And he stayed faithful all these years. And he's our go-to in Western Kenya. And he met me at the airport, and we drove the next day over to Jinja, Uganda. And I went over there to do a survey and to look at work they're doing. They work with World Bible School and also with World Radio. So I went over and spoke with their team, and I failed to get the picture up, but up there above that Africa is a statement in Uganda that says, Africans claiming Africa. I wonder where they got that. And what I want you to know is when I say that, I'm not talking about Ken Bolden. I was there, but I was there for you. This is hermitage, this is three-chopped work. Today, I'll be when I finish my teaching, I'm set up to do 7 seminars in various areas out in Western Kenya. And then I will go to either of 2 new works. If you ever dreamed about taking the gospel where people don't know anything about Jesus, you have to go to the desert. And I have a co-worker friend there named Mark Berryman from Zawali, Louisiana, who's been in Africa now for close to 40 years. He's a single, and he works with unreached people. And I have up here Datoga. The Datoga are a nomadic people, 2% literacy. How would you reach 2% literacy people? They buy little solar players. They have a recording of the New Testament in Datoga language, and they go out and hand that out to people. And these people herd their goats and camels and listen day after day to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, day after day. They baptized 530 people out there. It's amazing. And so over here on the right, they still live like this. That's a picture like out of National Geographic, but they still live in those primitive conditions. This year we went up to northern Kenya to the Rendeli. The Rendeli are camel herders and goat herders that live in the desert about 9 hours north of Nairobi between the highlands and Ethiopia. 2% literacy. 2%. And we have a guy that was teaching for us in the school Great Commission School. He was raised up there. His father called him in when he was 15 and told him, "You're not going to make it as a goat herder and camel herder," and put him in the first grade at 15. He holds a master's degree. He's a great Bible teacher, great theologian. Was living the good life in Nairobi. His wife is a licensed marriage counselor. And they decided to go home. And so they moved back up to the desert. And we have recording now of Randelli New Testament on these little solar players. And I was up there, we're riding up the road, and here's this guy dressed like these guys over on the left, herding his camels, and he was listening to his solar player. Mark says, "What you listening to?" He said, "Titus." He said, "Why are you doing Titus?" He said, "I'm preaching Sunday." Flintstones meeting Jetsons. It is that, and I'm working on. They do FM radio on their cell phones. Everybody up there's got a cell phone. We're driving in the desert. We've been on the road like 9 hours and have turned off on this sandy road. It's been raining. Never rains up there. It's been raining. We had a hyena about yay big run in front of us. And all of a sudden, out of the bush steps these two guys. And they have this little calabash, this little gourd full of camel milk to give to Stephen, our host. And they sit there and talk for a while, and then we move on. And I asked Stephen, I said, "How do those guys know where to meet us out here in the middle of nowhere? I mean, there's lions, there's leopards, there's hyenas. I mean, and they're out there without flashlights." I said, "How did they know?" He said, "Oh, we were texting." I love it. Here I am. There are 7 clans of Randelli, and at certain times of the year, the 7 clans come in and sort of put up their little wigwam huts in the same vicinity. And I'm speaking to the elders of the 7 clans about Jesus. And that's me standing back there in the back. You can barely see me, but standing back by the car. I'm loving that work. I'm hoping that's where I go again this year. So in the last 2 years, I've done 14 one-week seminars in East Africa. And I go out. I don't teach these at collegiate level. These are at practical church level. My theme last year was the 10 Commandments of Jesus. Any of you know about the 10 Commandments of Jesus? Come on. You don't know, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom? He's saying, be humble. You don't know, blessed are they that mourn? They'll be comforted. That means quit being concerned about yourself and look out there and grieve over the world. That's why those guys were all martyrs. You don't know, blessed are the meek? They'll inherit the earth. That means get your emotions under control. That's going to be a model of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. The problem is we were never taught that. And so I'm trying to get out and trying to teach that. And that's probably what I'll do at Great Commission School. Talk about foundations for Christian ethics. Do you know the first thing Jesus taught? If you read in chapter 4, he's not yet chosen of Matthew. He's not yet chosen disciples. And he goes out to the desert, tempted by Satan. When he comes out of the desert, he begins doing miracles, and he begins choosing disciples and teaching. And he chose the disciples. Chapter 5, seeing the multitudes. These are people wanting miracles. They're wanting what he's got to give. And the passage says, seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain and sat down. That is sitting like on the Moses seat. That is the position of authority for instruction. And he called his disciples to him. Those people down there on the bottom of that mountain were not yet disciples. He called his 12 to them. And the first thing he taught his 12 was not about atonement, reconciliation, forgiveness of sins, the grace of God. The first thing Jesus taught his 12 was how to behave and how to be as a foundation for building the kingdom of God. And I am preaching that as my second gospel. And so what's next for 2025? Why am I in here? March 17 through March 15, I'm supposed to be back in Addis Ababa. I'll be teaching the prophet Isaiah, Old Testament sacrificial system. Animal sacrifice was my doctoral thesis, so that's fun. March 17 through 28, I'll be at Nairobi Great Commission School, and look what I'm going to be teaching. Beatitudes, Foundation of Christian Ethics. And then March 30th through April 5th, I'll be out in Kisii, Kenya, Winyo, Kenya, Sotik, Kenya, at Bible College, Bomet, working with their prison ministry, up to the desert. I'm not going to let any moss grow under my feet. So, conclusion. Just what exactly is it that you do? Well, I have a little card that has the gospel. Some of you have been in Ben's class and have seen that model of the arrow coming down and the cross and the tomb and the arrow going up. And on the back of my card it says Ken Bolden, missionary at large. And people will look at that. What it says, first thing it says questions, because that picture is designed to make people ask questions. And you look on the back and it says Ken Bolden, missionary at large. And they'll say, what is that? And I'll say, well, it has nothing to do with my size. It has to do with my roaming. I handed out 250 of those cards on my last trip. Had that many conversations. Just had a card, start a conversation. You could do that. You could do that. Jesus did not save us to sit, he saved us to serve. And there's not anybody in here that can't stop at a service station, fill up gas, and hand somebody a card. I'm just saying. What do? I teach. That's what I've always done. That's what I will continue to do, Lord willing. I'll do this. I hope to die with my boots on. And so that's the Ken Bolden story.
Stay here. Do you understand why I wanted, or why we in the missions team wanted you to hear this story? As Ken said, this is part of our DNA. This is the leaders, Bill and Mary Ruth, Ken Huff. Those leaders back in those days had that vision and the courage to step out and got hold of guys like Ken and Lawrence Barr.
Barry Rosie.
And the word is going out across the planet. And the exciting thing is, to me, and I know it's exciting to you, is to see the second and third generations coming along in those countries. Africans reaching Africans as a result of the partnership that we have had with these mission folks. Now, we talk about everyone, as Ken just said, every person is a missionary. Here, wherever you are, you're a missionary. But I want us all to be excited about what God is doing, not us. This is what God is doing through the way he's blessing us. We're going to be supporting Ken in his work, continuing work. We've got all kinds of other work on our radar screen in addition to what Ken is doing. So when we're thinking about God's work and what we're about today, this is Mission Giving Sunday. Let the Spirit lead you in your giving today so that we can continue through God the work that's been done, and that the saving word can go out. Can you tell I'm excited? I get excited.
And Ben, what I wanted the church to know is that even though I'm up in Ethiopia and there aren't Luos there yet, this is still a part of you. I would not be there. I would have not gone there in the first place if it were not for you. I didn't mention we now have Luos from South Nyanza, Kenya, second, third generation, out in 5 African nations.
Amen.
Acts 1, verse 8. Jesus is risen. He's speaking for this 40 days with the apostles. And he says, you're going to go down to Jerusalem, and you're going to be my witnesses. You know it. In Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, uttermost parts of the world. That's what they did. You read the book, that's your outline for Acts. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, uttermost parts of the world. What you don't know is that Lawrence Barr and I preached that so much that back in the 80s when we came, there were 2 guys here. They were members of the Hermitage Road Church. One was Bill Snell, the other one was Roy Myers. And they said, explain that to us again. And you've got churches like Southwest and Cold Harbor that were your Samaria or your Judea. And then you have that moving out, uttermost parts of the world. And that's still going on. The Weenyo Church that James Moore and Lawrence planted back in 1974 is a Jerusalem. It has churches around it. It has Samaria. Now, we've had 3 guys go work in South Sudan, the world's nearest nation. They see them as missionaries because that's what God designed for us to be.
Lord, lead us. Listen to the Spirit today.
Yep.
Amen.
Thank you
Ken.
all. Let's close our eyes real quick. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for each one's here. May our hearts be touched. We ask your blessings on Billy as he encourages us through your word. Let your word speak to us today. Help us be generous. Help us to do what you've called us to do, to take this gospel out of Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, to the uttermost part. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.